We're going to go ahead and get started. Ooh, I have all Dean's notes. No, I won't start with that. My name is Kelly Longo, and I'm the Deputy Director of Government Affairs for the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you all for joining us today. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy think tank with offices in Sacramento and San Francisco. For today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPIC's Associate Survey Director, Dean Bonner, who will present the findings on Californians and their government survey. We'd like to thank the James Irvine Foundation and PPIC Donor Circle, as well as the PPIC Corporate Circle for their support and support of the beer bread that you're eating today as well. For the full survey report, along with the crosstabs and time trends for adults and likely voters, as well as the slides from today's presentations, are actually already online at ppic.org. A couple of quick things before we begin. We have an event coming up on October 11th at the Capitol Event Center on the census. Anybody interested in the census in here? Woohoo! I got some enthusiastic hand raising there. I like it. We'll be doing an event on October 11th at the Capitol Event Center, so make sure to sign up for that. Later today, you will, of course, get a survey, and please take a few minutes to fill that out and let us know how we did. Of course, please turn off or silence your cell phones. And after Dean's presentation, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. This particular survey is obviously very timely with the election right around the corner. I want to point out that there were some interesting regional differences you can find when looking at both the candidates and the initiatives in the crosstabs that I mentioned earlier online. One of the more interesting findings was that when we asked two questions each on the initiatives, one with the ballot title and summary, and a generic question, there were definitely differences. There's a great Cal Matters article that came out on that today, so I just want to make sure everybody quizzes Dean on that later. With that being said, I'd like to invite up to the podium Dean Bonner.
Thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time out of your day to join us here today. So the mission of the statewide survey is, which has been going on since 1998, is to provide timely relevant data on political, social, and economic opinions. Our kind of viewpoint is to inform the policy process by giving a voice to all Californians. We interview Californians overall and then kind of break findings down to likely voters. But we think it's important that the majority of our questions are asked of all Californians so that we can see the differences between those who are registered to vote and those who aren't. We've been providing a voice for all Californians since 1998, and we've interviewed over 350,000 Californians in over 170 surveys. So this series is funded by the James Irvine Foundation, as Kelly mentioned, as well as the PPIC Donor Circle. We interviewed 1,700 Californians from September 9th through the 18th. That includes 964 who we deem likely to vote. The margin of errors on that are 3.4 for the adults and 4.8 for the likely voters. We have two sections to the report. The front section is all about the election, where findings are presented among likely voters, where we look at the governor's race, Senate race, the kind of generic House ballot, as well as Proposition 6 and Proposition 10. And on the back half, we look at kind of opinions of some of our federal and state elected officials, immigration policy, the role of state government, and the importance of the Supreme Court justice choice. So we'll just dive right into the gubernatorial election. So what we've seen is that Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom continues to lead Republican John Cox by double digits, although his lead has been cut in half since July. It was 24, as you can see, in July, and today it's 12. An overwhelming share of Democrats favor Newsom, and a similar share of Republicans favor Cox. When it comes to the all-important group of independent or nonpartisan voters, we find that there's a 5-point difference with Newsom with a slight lead over Cox. So that'll be important to watch as we move forward given that the partisans kind of support their own candidate. We find that Newsom is favored by a large 38 points among Latinos, while white likely voters are evenly divided. We also find that, I should note that when I'm talking about likely voters, the sample for Asian American and African Americans are too small to break out individually, but we do present a group that includes basically other racial ethnic groups. And in the governor's race, people in this category are more likely to support Newsom than Cox. I should note also that on the back half of the report, we do actually report results among African Americans and Asian Americans. It's just among the likely voters that the sample size gets a little too small. Not surprisingly, there's a regional divide with Newsom being favored by wide margins in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, while the race is a little bit tighter and in favor of Cox in the Inland Empire, the Central Valley, and Orange San Diego. Some other findings of note: younger Californians age 18 to 44 favor Newsom by 23 points, women favor Newsom by 23 points, and college graduates favor Newsom by 25 points. The flip side of those, we find that those 45 and older are divided, men are divided, and people with less education are also divided. So there's some stark divisions there when it comes to support for Newsom. We also like to ask a question concerning the satisfaction of the choice of candidates. We've been asking this all the way through, even during the primary, and today we find that 6 in 10 likely voters are satisfied with their choices. That includes 72% of Democrats and just 44% of Republicans, while half of independents are satisfied. In 2014, we found that a similar share of 55% were satisfied, with a similar party breakdown at that time. However, in 2010, we found that basically 45% were satisfied with their choices. Back to today, we find that at least half across regions and demographic groups are satisfied with their choices. So satisfaction is pretty spread out. So in a matchup of 2 Democrats, thanks to our top 2 primary system, we find that Senator Dianne Feinstein leads Kevin De Leon by double digits. Although her lead has also been halved. It was 22 points in July, and it's 11 points today. Among Democrats, Senator Feinstein leads by a 2-to-1 margin over Kevin De Leon. And notably, we find that half of Republicans and a quarter of independent likely voters say that they're not going to vote in this race. We do have some history regarding this. In 2016, there was about 1.9 million fewer votes cast for the Senate election than for the presidential election. So there is a share of the electorate that will not vote in this race. And so that's important to note. And when we exclude those people who say they won't vote, we find that Senator Feinstein has a 52 to 37 lead. So her lead grows when you take out those people who say they won't vote. We find that Senator Feinstein leads among likely voters in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles, while the race is closer in Central Valley, the Inland Empire, and Orange San Diego, similar to what we found in the governor's race. Senator Feinstein leads among women, while men are divided. She also leads among white likely voters, while Latinos are divided. And so some similarities there when you look at the governor's race and the Senate race, but there are some differences as well, especially considering the Latino likely voters being divided in this case. Regarding satisfaction with their Senate candidates, we find that 55% of likely voters today are satisfied and 37% are not satisfied. Republicans are much less satisfied than Democrats, and about half of independents say they're satisfied. In 2016, when it was Kamala Harris and Loretta Sanchez, we found that half of likely voters were were satisfied, so not too far off what we find today. And in 2010, we found that 64% of likely voters were satisfied. Satisfaction across regions ranges from a high of 65% in the San Francisco Bay Area to a low of 40% in the Inland Empire. And among those who are not satisfied, we find that about half say they would not vote. So not surprising, a lot of the not satisfied is among Republican likely voters, and therefore that kind of half of people who wouldn't vote is kind of transferred over to those who are not satisfied. Among those who are satisfied, nearly 6 in 10 likely voters support Feinstein, while 30% support Kevin De Leon. So with much being made about the role that California could play in the overall kind of makeup of the new House of Representatives comes 2019, we wanted to ask folks how they feel about this midterm compared to last. And we see that about half of likely voters say that this midterm is more important than past midterms, with another more than 4 in 10 saying that it's about the same as in the past. This is similar to the findings we found in March when we asked this question. As you can see, there's a big gap between Democrats and Republicans, and people are pointing out that this could be related to an enthusiasm gap, and that's something to watch as we kind of move forward, because if you're more enthusiastic, you're potentially more likely to make sure that you vote, and so that will play an important role when it comes to House races. I should note that we also are able to break down the findings among congressional districts, and we do that kind of in 3 different ways. We look at ones that are currently held by Democrats, ones that are currently held by Republicans, and then ones that are deemed competitive by the Cook Political Report. Today, there are 11 competitive districts in California, with 2 being Democratic and 9 being Republican. And in the competitive House districts today, we find that 53% say that this midterm is more important than ones in the past, so kind of similar to the overall finding. And then in Democratic held districts, that's at 54% more important compared to 47% in Republican held districts. So when we actually look at the generic ballot of, if the election were held today, would you vote for, the Democrat or the Republican in your House district? There's also like a lean to, would you lean to the Republican or lean to the Democrat? And what we see is that Democrats have a 17-point edge in this question, with a slim majority saying that they would vote for the Democrat. In those Democratic held seats, there's a 35-point lead for Democrats. In the Republican held seats, there's a 21-point lead for Republicans, and it's divided in those competitive districts. Not all that surprising, and that's similar to findings that we've been seeing at the national level, as well as individual House districts within California that we've been looking at polling at. We find that Democrats are preferred by large margins in San Francisco, Bay Area, and Los Angeles, while Republican candidates are preferred by narrower margins in Inland Empire, Orange, San Diego, and the Central Valley. Democrats are favored by 41 points among Latinos in these races, 68 to 27, while whites are more divided, and those members in other racial ethnic groups have a strong preference for Democrats over Republicans. It is noteworthy that among younger likely voters, those 18 to 44, Democrats hold a strong lead of 62 to 25, while among those older likely voters, Democrats still lead, but it's 50 to 42. And so it's a little bit slimmer there. So we also wanted to get at what type of things people are looking for when it comes to their members of Congress that they're going to be electing. And with establishment politicians being challenged across the country and in California, it's not all that surprising that by a 10-point margin, likely voters prefer experience over someone who is new to politics. Democrats prefer someone who has experience by 31 points, while Republicans prefer someone who is new to politics by 14 points. And so we also find the independents on this question are kind of divided. Female likely voters, in a kind of noteworthy finding, prefer experience by over 20 points, while men are closely divided on this question. And that's kind of also a makeup of the kind of men are slightly more likely to be Republicans, and so that kind of transfers over there. So we also wanted to get a look at some of the ballot propositions. There are many on the ballot this year, and we can never ask all of them. In this case, we're asking about 2 of them, which, if you follow our surveys, is a drop from the 4 that we would normally do in past surveys. But given the makeup of cell phones and other things, we just weren't able to do more than 2 at this time. But we chose 2 very important ones that we feel, at least. Proposition 6 would repeal the recent gas tax increases. It also has an element to it that would require future increases to be approved by the electorate. And what we find is that just over half of likely voters would vote no, with 4 in 10 saying they would vote yes, and just 8% saying they're unsure. As you might guess, this is somewhat of a partisan issue, with 62% of Democrats saying that they would vote no, and half of Republicans saying that they would vote yes. And in fact, the only group among party, regional, and demographic groups to reach 50% are Republicans. And so that kind of shows that the widespread opposition here, or the lack of support across many groups. When we asked a more general question that we've asked kind of earlier in the year, that just kind of said, recently the governor and legislature passed a gas tax increase, and there's an effort to repeal it. Would you favor or oppose repealing the gas tax? And what we actually found is that about 50% are in favor of repealing the gas tax in a very generic sense, with 67% of Republicans saying that they favor this effort. So that's a 17-point gap between the actual ballot proposition and kind of a more general question on this. 35% of Democrats would be in favor, and 55% of independents. And so it's noteworthy that, that as people learn more about this initiative, it'll be interesting to see how this generic question comes into play, because with half saying they kind of favor the idea, is it that they don't like the element that that requires future increases to be decided on by the electorate? Or is it this group of folks who kind of go into propositions with a default no response, and then you're kind of having to convince them that they should vote yes? And so that will be interesting to follow, but at this point, there's a lot of widespread kind of opposition to this. So at this point, it's definitely, there's an uphill battle for this to pass at this point. So the other ballot measure we asked about was Proposition 10, which seeks to expand local rent control authority. This too has about just under half of California likely voters saying that they vote no, 36% voting yes, and in this case, 16% are unsure how they would vote. Democrats are divided on this, 46% yes, 43% no. Republicans are more likely to vote no, as well as independents. About half of those 2 groups actually say they would vote no. And in fact, it fails to reach a majority across any group. Among groups that are kind of affected by this, we find that even among renters, just 43% say they would vote yes, 51% would vote no. Among homeowners who would potentially be impacted by this, we find that 31% would vote yes and 49% would vote no. In this case, we also asked a general question about, do you think rent control is a good thing or a bad thing? With a slight explanation about rent control being the ability of local governments to control how much rent could increase. And we find in this case, once again, there's more support for the general question, with half of Californians saying that rent control is a good thing and 41% saying it's a bad thing. In this case, 69% of Democrats say that it's a good thing, which is an increase of 23 points from the ballot measure. And 34% of Republicans say it's a good thing, and that's an increase of 12 points from the actual proposition. Among renters and owners, we find that among renters, there's a 24-point increase. It bumps all the way up to 67%, while among homeowners, it goes from 31% to 44%. So once again, we're seeing this dynamic of people are kind of like the idea overall. Granted, it's a slim majority, but once again, what's going to play into effect here? Will there be more spending on the yes or the no side? Will this kind of impact people's ability to see kind of how they feel on this? It is important to note there's 16% don't know in this case, and so that's a pretty sizable margin of people that don't know at this point. So there is some room for movement there. So moving on from the election, which it seems like at some point we'll be able to do that, not quite yet though. We asked about Governor Brown as he nears the end of his final years in office, and about the California legislature, and both continue to enjoy positive approval ratings. In fact, it's been since January 2014 that Governor Brown's approval has been at least 48% or higher. So he's had a really long run of near half of Californians approving of him. Today, not surprisingly, 7 in 10 Democrats are in favor, 14% of Republicans are, 71% of Democrats approve, 14% of Republicans approve, and about 4 in 10 independents. His approval is higher in where you might consider the more liberal areas, San Francisco and Los Angeles, while about 4 in 10 elsewhere approve of his job performance. His job performance approval is higher among African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos than among whites. And there are similar trends when it comes to the legislature, where there's higher approval in SF and LA. And when we take a look at what share of the electorate is actually approving of both the legislature and the governor. So we find that 37% actually approve of both the governor and the legislature, which is a fairly sizable share of Californians who approve of both. We also asked about your own legislative representative, and we found that 47% approve of their performance, with Democrats twice as likely as Republicans to approve of their own representative, which makes sense considering the share of representatives that are in seats held by Democrats versus Republicans. A little bit different story when it comes to Californians' opinions of their federal elected officials. Compared to the state's elected officials, President Trump and Congress fare much worse. President Trump's approval in California has basically ranged from a high of 31% in March 2017, in January 2017, to a low of 25%. So it's a very narrow kind of band that he's been looking at in California, and that's basically all of our data on President Trump right there. So you can see it's always been about a third or below. We also find that Congress is at 28%, and approval of Congress is at 40% or below across age, education, regional party groups. In the all-important competitive districts, we find that 64% disapprove of Congress. Sorry about that. And when we look at both the president and Congress, we actually find that 43% disapprove of both President Trump and Congress combined. And so that's higher than the 37% who actually approved of both elected officials at the state level. So about twice a year, we like to ask about our California senators. It's especially important today as Senator Feinstein seeks another term. It would be her 5th full term. And as Senator Harris and Senator Feinstein have seen a more prominent role when it comes to the confirmation hearings currently going on. And what we found is that both have the approval of 44% of Californians and slight majorities of likely voters. In both cases, about 7 in 10 Democrats and 1 in 5 Republicans approve, and about half of independents approve. When we look at your own representative, we find that somewhat similar, about 4 in 10, just below half approve of their own representative. And it's notable that approval of your own representative is divided in both Orange, San Diego, and in competitive districts. And of course, a lot of people are looking at those districts down in Orange and San Diego as very competitive. And so the fact that, that you have approval of those representatives being divided is something that you could kind of look at as a potential factor when it comes to November. So looking at how Californians are feeling about the state more generally, we find out about half of Californians think that the state is headed in the right direction and view the economy positively. Democrats are more likely than Republicans and independents to hold these views. However, it's interesting that Republicans are 27 points more likely to view the economy favorably than to view California heading in the right direction. And so they have this real positive, not all that positive, but more positive look at the economy over the next 12 months than they do when it comes to the direction of California. And what we also find is that when it comes to the economy, Democrats are actually 10 points lower. So there's kind of a divide there where Republicans feel better about the economy than the direction, while Democrats feel less positive about the economic times than about the direction. Inland Empire residents are the least likely to be optimistic on either count, and Asian Americans and Latinos are more optimistic on both measures than African Americans and whites. So immigration policy and the kind of federal crackdown on undocumented immigrants remains in the news and remains something that Californians basically feel negatively about. Today we see that half say that the federal crackdown is a bad thing, with 39% saying it's a good thing. As you might expect, there are some partisan differences there, with them falling on opposite sides of this issue, and independents actually kind of falling on the 56% saying it's a bad thing. Majorities of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos say it's a bad thing, while whites are more divided on this issue. And we find that 6 in 10 younger Californians say it's a bad thing, while fewer than half of older Californians say this. So there's a real generational gap there as well. And women are more likely than men to say that the federal crackdown is a bad thing. We also wanted to ask a question we've asked about in the past, how people feel about being worried about someone they know being deported. And what we find that is that Latinos and those not born in the United States are by far the most likely to be worried a lot. Not just to be worried some, but you see that 55% of Latinos are worried a lot, and 49% of those not born in the U.S. are worried a lot. That number among people who are today not born in the U.S. and not citizens is even higher than 49%. It's at 58% today. And so that kind of is in line with the Latino number. Being worried a lot decreases sharply with rising education and income. And there's more worry among those 18 to 54 than 55 and older. And being worried a lot is highest in Los Angeles and lowest in the Inland Empire and Orange, San Diego. So there's a big divide here again between kind of the place that people are in life, whether you're more educated and more wealthy versus less, and how basically in some ways it's how much exposure you have to people who could be deported is really one way to look at this. So we also, as I mentioned, wanted to ask about the importance of the Supreme Court, the importance of the choice of the next Supreme Court justice, to see kind of how do people view this choice? How important is it? And what we found is that regardless of your party registration or where you live or which demographic groups you belong to, everyone says that the choice of the next Supreme Court justice is very important. However, the perception that is very important is 11 points higher among Democrats than Republicans, and also highest among older, more educated, and those with higher incomes. It is viewed similarly among men and women, and notably, it's kind of similar across regions. We've been seeing a lot of regional differences here with LA and SF kind of setting themselves apart, but in this case, we see that, across regions, it's viewed similarly as very important. And that's also related to kind of the partisan finding, where we see that, most people across party groups view this as very important. So obviously, one issue in particular that a lot of people are talking about in reference to the next Supreme Court justice is the Roe v. Wade decision. And what we find is that similar to the importance of the choice, majorities across parties, regions, and demographic groups do not want to see Roe v. Wade overturned. This is consistent with past surveys, and we look at today, while we do see a majority of Republicans saying that they don't want to see it overturned, we see that Democrats are 30 points higher than Republicans on this. We also find that's highest in the San Francisco Bay Area at 81% and lowest in the Inland Empire at 55%. 55% of Latinos versus more than 70% in the other racial ethnic groups want to see it overturned. So there's a difference there among Latinos versus the rest of the racial ethnic groups. We do see that it's similar across age groups, but higher among more educated and more affluent voters. More affluent Californians do not want to see it overturned. It's similar among men and women. And I should note that on both this question and on the question about the importance of Supreme Court justice, Californians hold similar opinions to adults nationwide in Pew Research surveys in the case of the importance question, and Kaiser Family Foundation question when it comes to the overturning Roe v. Wade. So California in this case doesn't necessarily stand out a whole lot, at least at the top line. So one question that is always important when it comes to kind of how people think about electing candidates is kind of what role do they see the state government playing. And on this issue, we see that Californians are both closely divided and divided across parties. And so across regions, majorities in SF and in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles want higher taxes and more services, while in the Central Valley Inland Empire, while in the Inland Empire they want lower taxes and fewer services, and in the Central Valley and Orange, San Diego, they're more divided on this topic. 6 in 10 Latinos and African Americans say they want a larger government with higher taxes and more services, while Asian Americans and whites are closely divided on this. The preference for higher taxes and more services declines as age increases. And not surprisingly, in those important competitive districts, we find that that people who live in those areas are actually divided on this. So one important question when it comes to the role of government is, what should state government do when it comes to the increasing gap between the rich and the poor? And looking at the role of government, we find that 6 in 10 say that state government should do more, Not surprisingly, partisans are divided, but independents are actually saying that state government should do more to reduce this gap. There are majorities across regions say that state government should play a larger role here, and at least half across racial, ethnic, age, education, and income groups say that the state should be doing more, but the perception is lower among whites, where it's less than 50%, and declines with increasing age and income. Should be noted that it's highest among racial ethnic groups at 82% among African Americans. So there's a 32-point gap between the highest Asian African Americans and the lowest whites at 50%. So in conclusion, we find today that among likely voters in California, Gavin Newsom and Dianne Feinstein continue to lead, but that their leads have both been halved since July. Half of likely voters in Californians are viewing this midterm election as more important than past, and Democrats have about a 17-point margin when it comes to the generic ballot. Propositions 6 and 10 are actually opposed by half of likely voters. However, half of likely voters are actually in favor of the general concepts behind these propositions, which is important. Governor Brown and the state legislature are viewed much more positively than President Trump and Congress. And about half of Californians say that the federal immigration crackdown is a bad thing, and about half are actually worried that someone they know could be deported as a result of these federal actions. We also, as I mentioned, saw that there's a widespread view that the choice of the next Supreme Court justice is very important, and most Californians, 2 and 3, don't want to see the Roe v. Wade decision overturned, with majorities across parties in that case. So at this point, I will open it up for questions, but make sure that that someone with a mic actually comes by so that we can, so that the people watching this later can actually hear it. Yes.
Hi. Could you chat about some of the regional variation for support or opposition for Prop 6? If I recall correctly, it was much less popular in the Inland Empire than in the Bay Area, which struck me as very surprising.
Yeah, so I think what I would say to that is I believe you are right, but it was support falls short of a majority across all those regions, and so I think it is somewhat surprising that the Inland Empire area that has more conservative views than some of the other questions would feel that way. But I would need more time to kind of look at the data and see where, kind of what the makeup is, and see some other issues there. Yes.
Thank you. On the last part where you asked about should state government do more to address gap and inequality,
yes.
Did you ask any more detailed questions for the people that said yes? Like, do they think more in education or early childhood or health or?
Yeah, not at this time, just because we're limited to about 17 and a half minutes, and that's always a challenge. Obviously, that is a very important topic that you could spend a whole survey when it comes to reducing, whether it be economic mobility or income inequality. But at this time, we kind of just wanted to get that snapshot to kind of see how Californians feel about it. But we do ask about kind of other questions and other surveys when it that gets at that somewhat, as well as kind of economic disparities when it comes to higher education and K-12 education in certain areas as well. Yes.
Do you have data from past elections with independents in how they actually split in their vote in the final vote in November that you can compare with what it looks like this year?
So we would obviously have data on how independents were feeling in our last survey, which is generally conducted just shy of 2 weeks prior to the election. that you can look and see kind of how independents were feel. I don't have a lot of that information off the top of my head. I do know that the independents tend to be lean towards, when you ask them which party you find yourself closer to, they tend to lean closer to the Democratic Party. But as we saw in this survey, it really depends on the issue. There are some issues where they kind of, quote unquote, side with the Republicans, and other issues that they side with the Democrats, and then other issues where they themselves are divided. And so that's why it's important to look at the independents, because they're going to definitely play a role when it comes to some of these ballot measures and elections. Yeah.
The question around the propositions, could you say a little bit more? I think you started to address some of the reasons, or at least some of the hypotheses for why there's a gap between sort of general support for those measures versus the actual ballot propositions. Could you say a little bit more about those reasons? And I didn't hear you earlier talk about the title of those ballot measures, so I'm particularly curious about that if you've looked at that.
Right. So a big part of what happens when we have ballot measures is that there's a title and summary. And that's determined by the Attorney General's office and is often litigated because of how important it is. People may point to the case of Prop 6, which off the top of my head mentions something about reducing funding for infrastructure, essentially is what it says. And so that obviously will play somewhat of a role if you tell people that, it's one thing to say, yes, I favor reducing those taxes, or to, repeal the gas tax increases. But it's another if you tell them that, well, this is actually going to cut into infrastructure work that is being done in your neighborhood or in your area or across the state. As I also mentioned, in that case, the fact that future increases might have to go back to the electorate. People like the initiative process, but maybe they just don't feel that that's something that they want to have to vote on every time. And then there's the sense that there's a share of the electorate who come into these things with a no response. Like, I'm not going to support a ballot measure. I'm against the initiative process, or for whatever reason, and they need to be convinced to the yes. And so for something like this, I think you're probably seeing a conglomeration of those impacts there, especially when you look at that generic ballot question, or the kind of generic question where you see the half are in favor and then it kind of flips to half opposed. And so I think there are a lot of things. Regarding Prop 10, it mentions something about residential property. So as a homeowner, if you even have a slight inkling that you might want to rent out your house in the future, that might be enough to have you vote no. And so I think in that one, perhaps is a little more confusing. You saw 16% don't know on that. And so, but once again, half favor the idea of rent control. And so it'll be interesting to see how much money is being spent on these campaigns and what arguments they're making. And so.
Hi. California now has a Secretary of State that's making a big push to register young voters on school campuses, right, other places. And I read a story today that talked about how of those young voters that are pre-registering, over 200,000 of them now, I think I read, the majority of them are choosing decline to state. Maybe 10% are choosing Republican, another 20 are choosing Democrat. Also reading a lot of stories and hearing another question about third-party candidates. Well, we've had one here in California, right? Adi Bach, we had a Green Party member in our legislature. And she came in part because the people in the Oakland and Alameda area were very disgruntled by the machine and how it was treating them. And she won by only 1,000 votes, but she won.
Right.
And I hear a lot of people talking about, third parties, they got no hope. And maybe that's true for 2018. 2020 could be a different story. So I was a little curious. I came a little late. I missed your full presentation, but I looked through the report earlier, and I didn't see any mention at all about youth. I'm curious, what age do you survey? Are you considering looking at the youth vote in the future?
Yeah.
Just where are we going with that?
So generally speaking, for our kind of all-adult population, we can look at 18 to 34 and 35 to 54 and 55 older, and some other kind of smaller gradations where sample size applies. But when it comes to the likely voter sample, it basically goes from 1,700 down to 964. And so at that point, we really don't have enough to sample the 18 to 34, which I think were just about 65 people. But we do have enough to when we go 18 to 44. And so that's kind of the break that we used. And I should add that, you know, the increase in no party preference isn't just among the younger, it's increasing across the state and across age groups. That's also being driven somewhat by what's happening with the DMV registration, where you're seeing a lot more people who register at the DMV being declined to state voters. And so in the future, you know, they've already basically surpassed the Republican Party in sheer numbers. And I'm guessing when we get the 60-day close at some point, we will see that they've actually kind of gone even higher. And so they're definitely an important factor, but it's also important to note that with the top two primary, kind of partisanship matters less potentially, or at least in kind of sub-presidential races. In the presidential race, it's still going to be a factor, but it kind of matters less in those top two primaries.
Either next year or by 2020, you've been doing this for a long time with basically June and November being your primary focus dates. Now with the data centers, with the progressive vote, and with the change of, I believe it's to March of where the next presidential will be, how are you going to change your demographics, or are you going to restate what the statewide survey is going to be focused on? Because it seems like you've got a history one way, and now all of these change dramatically the impact of your survey.
Yeah. Well, I should add that we're in the field generally 8 to 9 times a year. And so we're consistently in the field. Regarding kind of the changes, it's definitely going to become a point where potentially partisan registration is going to matter less. And so then potentially you have to look at other factors. But, you know, each year after the election cycle is completed, we kind of do a step back. We look at what other people are doing. We look at the national folks are doing, some of the more respected state polls, and we kind of chart our course from there. That's how we got to 70% cell phone when just 6-7 years ago, we were at 10% or 0%. And so that happens on a yearly basis, that we're looking at what are we doing, how are we doing it, and can we do it better? And so that's a consistent thing that we're doing on an annual, if not semi-annual basis, kind of looking at those things. So, but we hope that, you know, we can, you know, find ways to still interview all Californians, because that's something that we really value, because we know that the people who turn out at the polls are different than the people who stay home or even registered. And so that's important to us, and that's part of our mission. And so, yes. Well, I would like to thank all of you for coming and spending part of your day with me. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to come up.